Congratulations, you're the new owner of the Blue Boobs Cactus. Depending on where you live, these plants aren't necessarily easy to find, nor cheap. Now, you're probably wondering, how do I keep this thing from dying? Well, that's where I'm going to come in. Today, in this video, I'm going to tell you everything from the soil it needs, when to water it, how much light, and everything in between, including a couple of myths along the way. So, strap yourselves in, and I'm going to give you the complete guide to Myrtillocactus geometrizans Fukurokuryuzinboku, otherwise known as the Blue Boobs Cactus. Here we go. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the soil your plant is going to be in. Depending on where you got it from, there's a very high chance that it'll be potted up in a very organic, moisture-retentive soil. These things are cacti and essentially come from quite arid parts of the world. Unsurprisingly, they don't need that level of moisture retentiveness. You can see this one here in a potting mix that's almost entirely organic. It's just going to hold too much water, and what that's going to do is probably quite quickly this plant will get infected with some kind of fungal disease. It'll rot and then it'll die, and we don't want that. So how do we prevent that? We're going to take typical potting mix. You can see here, nice ordinary potting mix infused with a little bit of slow release fertilizer, and we're going to mix that at a ratio of about 50-50 with some real chunky minerals. The nature of these minerals isn't all that important. Pumice is great, perlite will do. In here I've also got some fancy stuff like zeolite, sandstone. What else is in there? A bit of granite, but it doesn't really matter. What you're aiming for is a particle size of about at least 2 millimeters. This anywhere between 2 millimeters and 20 millimeters, and I'm very happy with this. So I'm going to be mixing in a bit of this into a bit of that, and the end result is we're going to have this wonderfully well draining, mineral rich soil, which is going to make our little booby cactus very happy. That'll probably do it. Mix all that together. You can see it all going in there. Look at that. Maybe I'll put one more scoop just for good measure. Always err on the side of caution, I say. All right, that's looking fantastic. So now I'm going to get that plant out of its pot, get the rubbish off its roots, and then put it into, we might put it into a bit of a bigger pot, give it a bit more room to move. What you'll find, because these are tall growing plants, give them a bit more root space, and they can actually put on that vertical height a little bit more quickly. So here we go, we'll get it out of its pot. Note, the blue in these plants is what we call a farina. It's a nice powdery coating, and when you touch it, it comes off. So we want to minimize how much we're actually going to touch this plant. There we go, you can see nice healthy roots going on there. So it's a good start. We'll just get rid of some of that soil. I'll be back in a second with all those roots cleared off. So I've cleared most of the muck off those roots. Got a pot pretty well loaded, ready to go. We just put that in there and we'll backfill it in. Now, when it comes to any species of cacti, always err towards the side of more well draining. These are plants that will grow quite happily, even in a mix that's entirely inorganic. They will need more water, and they probably need a bit more fertilizer, but they're going to be happier than if you're loading them up on that nutrient rich, moisture retentive, organic potting mix. So, something to bear in mind. And of course, if you're living somewhere that's hotter and drier, well, that's going to impact maybe the nature of the soil we use as well. So there we go. That's all potted up. But now, where are we going to put this thing and how are we going to water it? That's what comes next. It's all potted up, and now we're wondering, where are we going to put this thing? Well, when in doubt, always be guided by nature. Cacti, generally speaking, of course, are desert-dwelling plants. And there are three things that really define a desert habitat. They are, of course, relatively low moisture levels, and we'll talk about watering in a second. But the other two things are plenty of sun and lots of air movement. Deserts are windy places. What that means is that we can't stick this on our dining table away from a window. In fact, this is not a plant that we should be keeping indoors at all. It needs far too much sunlight. These are plants that are going to want full sun. A full sun position outside where there's a bit of air movement naturally occurring is the ideal place for this. However, before we just take our plant and stick it straight out into the blazing hot sun, something we need to be really careful of. We don't know where our plant has been grown, we don't know what the conditions are like. So if we put it straight into the sun, there's a very high chance that the plant will become sunburned. What does that mean? It means we have to very slowly and carefully transition it into its final full sun position. That means giving it incrementally slightly more sun each day until it's ready to take that level of abuse. So what I would recommend doing upon first potting it up, put it in a well-lit outdoors position, somewhere that doesn't get any direct sun, but it's still quite bright. Give it a few days in that space, and then maybe move it to a position that gets, I don't know, a very short, maybe 10, 20 minutes of sun. Keep an eye on it. You don't want to just leave it there in case, you know, your expectations aren't quite met. Because if this thing ends up in a position where it's just copping that sun, you're going to end up with a very sad plant indeed. Over the span of a few weeks, it will build up its resistance and its tolerance to full sun, and you can leave it out there and you'll have a very happy and very well growing plant. Now, let's talk about water. When it comes to watering a cactus, we might be thinking smaller is better, but that's something of a myth, because as long as the pot is well draining, and you can see in this case we've got nice holes underneath, plenty of space for water to run out. Whatever you do, don't put them into a pot with no drainage holes. That's a recipe for sadness, misery, rot and death. But if your pot's well draining, they can take plenty, because what they don't want is to be waterlogged. They don't want to be sitting in stagnant water for a long period of time. But in actual fact, they can take relatively frequent waterings. The plants in my collection, I will, over the warmer months, often water them twice a week. It is going to depend on the nature of your soil. If you put your plant into a more heavy organic mix, less is probably better. If you put them into terracotta pots, which soak up and remove some of the water from the soil, you can probably water them more often. And when it comes to water, we don't need to hold back. We want to water them until it's pouring out of the drainage holes, as we can illustrate here. Just going to go, 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 go. And now we can see all that water coming out the base. Deep watering, regular watering when it's warm makes these plants happy. What about when it's cold? Well, cacti, generally speaking, go dormant over the winter time. And that's a period, depending on where we live, where we are going to need to be a little bit more careful and a little bit more restrained when it comes to watering. Know your climate. These plants are frost intolerant. So if you live in a place that will get to those freezing temperatures, you're going to need to think of a plan to take care of this over the winter time. Bringing it inside, keeping it very well lit, keeping temperatures cool so it's not growing. If you can reduce the amount of growth that this plant goes through over the winter time, it's certainly going to be much happier, and then you can take it outside again. In my case, living in wonderful temperate Sydney, this is a plant that's going to be living outdoors all year round, and it's going to take whatever rain it gets over the winter, but I won't be watering it any more than that. So that is Myrtillocactus geometrizans Fukurokuryuzinboku, the blue booby cactus. Really, they're pretty straightforward plants. What's well worth knowing though, this plant is a cultivar. What that means is that every single one of this plant has been propagated from the one original mutation that made it look like this. You will see some unscrupulous people online selling seeds for this plant. They never flower, so they can never produce seeds. Don't get sucked in. You can only get them in their full vegetative form like this. And now hopefully you know a little bit more about caring for them, keeping them happy, and helping them grow to turn into big, impressive specimens that can be a feature in your collection. And as far as I'm concerned, fantastic conversation starter. I'm Michael from Aridzine. If you've got any questions, chuck them into the comments. Otherwise, happy growing, and I'll see you next time.